The story of the American aircraft carrier in the Second World War does not begin with triumph, but with shock, confusion, and a nation forced to reconsider everything it believed about modern warfare. On the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy suffered one of the most devastating blows in its history. Battleships, the proud giants of the fleet, burned or lay half sunken in the harbor. Yet the ships the Japanese most hoped to destroy were nowhere to be found. By coincidence, every operational American aircraft carrier in the Pacific was at sea. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga survived the attack simply because they were not present, and these three ships would soon become the fragile backbone of American naval power. Before the war, few people truly understood what an aircraft carrier represented. Many senior officers still believed in the supremacy of the battleship, just as their fathers had. Carriers were considered experimental, dangerous to operate, and vulnerable. Pilots flying from their decks were often seen as daredevils, rather than the decisive edge in naval warfare. But the war that was now unfolding in the Pacific Ocean would be unlike any conflict humanity had ever seen, and it would be the carrier, not the battleship, that determined victory or defeat. The United States, wounded but unbroken, would have to learn this lesson quickly. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, America stood face to face with the harsh reality of Japanese military power. Japan had one of the finest naval air arms in the world, led by pilots who had spent years perfecting the techniques of carrier warfare. Their aircraft were advanced, their tactics ruthless, and their confidence enormous. Across the Pacific, territory after territory fell to Japanese offensives. The Philippines were collapsing, Singapore was doomed, and American forces retreated again and again. The only units capable of striking back with speed and reach were the aircraft carriers that had survived the initial attack. Life aboard an American carrier in these early months was tense, exhausting, and filled with uncertainty. Flight crews worked day and night to maintain the aircraft that would be needed at a moment's notice. Aviation fuel permeated the air. The smell of hot oil and the constant hammering of tools echoed through narrow metal corridors. On deck, mechanics checked engines, loaded torpedoes, and armed bombs. Every flight might be the first encounter with a skilled enemy whose abilities were not yet fully understood. But the men serving aboard these floating airfields believed in their mission. They understood that the fate of the Pacific might rest on their shoulders. The first American counterblows were small but symbolic. One of them, perhaps the most daring early gesture of defiance, was the Doolittle raid. In April 1942, 16 medium bombers, far larger than any aircraft meant for carrier operations, were launched from the deck of the USS Hornet. Their mission was to strike Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. Militarily, the raid caused limited damage, but its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese citizens saw American bombs fall on their homeland. The raid proved that Japan was not untouchable. It gave the American public hope and reminded the Japanese command that the aircraft carrier was an unpredictable and far-reaching threat. But symbolism alone could not stop the Japanese advance. Real battles were coming, battles that would test the carrier concept to its limits. The first of these, the Battle of the Coral Sea, took place in May 1942 and changed the nature of naval warfare forever. It was the first major engagement in history in which the ships of opposing fleets never saw each other. There were no gun duels, no battleship broadsides. Instead, airplanes launched from carriers did all the fighting. The USS Lexington and USS Yorktown faced off against the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Juikaku in a long and brutal struggle across hundreds of miles of open water. Pilots searched vast areas of ocean, hoping to locate the enemy before being located themselves. When they finally found their targets, they had to dive through walls of anti-aircraft fire, trusting skill, training, and luck to carry them through. The Lexington was mortally damaged and ultimately lost, leaving a deep scar on the American Navy. But Japan's two main carriers were so battered that they were unable to participate in the next far more crucial battle. It was a costly fight for both sides, but for the United States it was a strategic victory. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been halted. Yet the ocean was about to demand even more from the American carrier force. Repairs to the surviving carrier, USS Yorktown, were rushed with desperate urgency. Dock workers labored around the clock in Pearl Harbor, often working to the point of collapse. They rebuilt the ship in 3 days, a near miracle, because intelligence had revealed a shocking and invaluable secret. The Japanese Navy, confident and eager to finish what it had begun, planned to attack a small atoll called Midway. What Japan did not know was that American codebreakers had cracked parts of their naval communications. The United States not only knew the objective of the operation, but the timing as well. It was this knowledge that allowed the battered carrier fleet to sail out once more into what would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. By early June 1942, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown moved into position near Midway Atoll. Their air groups prepared to face a Japanese strike force centered around 4 of the same carriers that had attacked: Pearl Harbor, Akage, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Japanese fleet believed it was superior in every respect, more experienced, more powerful, and more aggressive. But what the Americans lacked in numbers, they made up for with determination, intelligence, and the ability to seize opportunity in the chaos of battle. Ahead lay a confrontation that would alter the balance of power in the Pacific and forever prove the dominance of the aircraft carrier in modern warfare.
As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean lay calm beneath a wide, pale sky. The American carrier groups were already awake, their crews moving through well-rehearsed routines, every man aware that this day could shape the fate of the entire war. A sense of tension hung over the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Pilots quietly reviewed briefing notes, studying maps and estimated positions of the Japanese fleet. Mechanics finished last-minute checks of fuel lines and bomb racks. Officers spoke in low voices. Everyone understood that what was about to happen would demand everything they had to give. It was a moment when training, experience, and sheer will would be tested as never before. Far to the northwest, the Japanese carriers were also preparing their morning strike, confident that the Americans were nowhere nearby. Their plan was straightforward: destroy the American presence on Midway Atoll, then annihilate any U.S. ships that came to its rescue. They believed they were initiating the action and that their superior numbers would guarantee success. What they could not know was that American scouts had already spotted elements of their fleet. The race was on. Whoever launched the first effective strike would hold the advantage. And, as American pilots climbed into their aircraft, fastening harnesses and adjusting oxygen masks, they knew they were heading into a battle of enormous scale. The first American squadrons to find the Japanese carriers were the torpedo bombers. These aircraft flew low and slow, making them easy targets for Japanese Zero fighters. But the men of the torpedo squadrons pressed on, wave after wave, even when they knew the odds were against them. Many never returned. Their sacrifice would later prove crucial, because their low attacks pulled the Japanese fighters down close to the ocean, leaving the skies above the carrier decks unguarded. What followed was one of the most dramatic turning points in naval history. High above, unseen by the torpedo crews who were fighting and dying below, American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. Through a combination of courage, timing, and sheer luck, they found the flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft and armed bombs. The dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown pushed their throttles forward, tilted their aircraft into steep dives, and released their payloads with deadly precision. Explosions tore through the flight decks of Akage, Kaga, and Soryu. Columns of flame rose into the sky. The Japanese carriers were fatally wounded within minutes, a sudden, catastrophic reversal of fortune that stunned even the Americans who had delivered the blow. Yet the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained operational and immediately launched counterstrikes. Her pilots, determined and skilled, located the Yorktown and scored direct hits. The ship shuddered under the impact of bombs and torpedoes. Fires spread across her decks, but the crew fought fiercely to keep her afloat. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. Damage control teams patched holes, restored systems, and managed to get the ship moving again. But Hiryu launched a second wave, and the Yorktown was struck once more. This time, the damage was beyond repair. The proud carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and rushed into battle after a miraculous reconstruction was now doomed. American pilots, driven by the same determination that had carried them through the day, eventually found Hiryu and delivered the final blow. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sinking. The aircraft crews who had attacked Pearl Harbor were now gone. The Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat so severe that it could never fully recover. The Battle of Midway had changed the trajectory of the war. The United States, still early in its transformation into a wartime giant, had delivered a strategic victory of enormous magnitude, and it had been won almost entirely by the courage and skill of carrier aviators. In the months that followed, the role of the aircraft carrier became ever more central to American strategy. The Pacific was vast and every mile of ocean had to be fought for. As the United States prepared to go on the offensive, it was clear that islands held by Japan could only be approached with the support of carrier air power. Amphibious landings, supply convoys, naval advances all depended on these powerful floating air bases. New carriers began to join the fleet. Essex-class carriers, larger and more advanced than their predecessors, rolled out of American shipyards at an impressive rate. Each one represented thousands of workers, millions of hours, and the industrial might of a nation fully mobilized for war. Meanwhile, life aboard the carriers continued with the same mix of routine and danger. Pilots trained constantly, learning the difficult skill of landing on a moving deck in rough seas. Flight operations required precision. A single mistake could send an aircraft skidding into the ocean or crashing into parked planes. The sailors on deck had to remain alert at all times, ducking under wings, avoiding propellers, and keeping clear of arrestor cables. Below decks, cooks prepared meals for thousands of men, engineers monitored engines, and medical teams treated injuries. The carrier was a city unto itself, crowded, noisy, and alive with purpose. As the U.S. Navy moved toward the next major campaign, Guadalcanal, the importance of these ships would only grow. The Pacific War was entering a new phase, one defined by relentless combat, exhaustion, and the slow, grinding process of taking back territory from a determined enemy. Aircraft carriers would be at the center of it all, their planes striking targets far inland, defending ground troops, and challenging Japanese naval power at every turn. The men who served aboard these carriers would come to understand the meaning of endurance, courage, and sacrifice in a way that few generations ever experience. The path ahead was long and filled with danger. But the victory at Midway had proven something vital. The United States could challenge the Imperial Navy and win. The carriers had shown their power. Now they would carry the war forward, island by island, battle by battle, toward the ultimate goal of ending the conflict and restoring peace to the Pacific. As the year 1942 drew toward its end, the United States Navy faced one of its most grueling tests, the campaign for Guadalcanal. This was not simply another battle. It was the beginning of a long, brutal offensive that would stretch American resources, push crews to the limits of endurance, and bring aircraft carriers into almost constant combat. The Japanese Empire, determined to maintain its dominance over the Pacific, poured enormous effort into holding the island. For months, both sides struggled endlessly, and the seas around Guadalcanal became some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. For the American carriers, these months were an ordeal of unrelenting tension. Enemy aircraft could strike at any time. Pilots often flew multiple missions per day, sometimes without adequate rest. The heat of the South Pacific was oppressive, and humidity seeped into every corner of the ships. Men slept in narrow bunks, often drenched in sweat. Below decks, temperatures could reach unbearable levels. But despite the exhausting conditions, the crews carried on. Every man understood the stakes. If the United States could hold Guadalcanal, it would begin to push Japan back. If it failed, the Japanese would regain the initiative and possibly threaten the sea routes to Australia. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 was the first major test of this new phase of the war. The USS Enterprise, already a veteran of multiple battles, played a central role. Her pilots sortied again and again, searching for Japanese surface forces and repelling air attacks. During one of the fiercest assaults, Japanese dive bombers pierced the carrier's defenses. Bombs exploded through the deck, sending flames and smoke across the ship. Damage control teams rushed forward, fighting fires with desperate urgency. Men carried hoses, dragged wounded crewmen to safety, and worked in suffocating heat to keep the Enterprise afloat. Despite serious damage, the ship survived, repaired at sea as best as possible, and returned to action. Just weeks later came the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Once again, Enterprise and her sister carriers faced a formidable Japanese fleet. This time, the USS Hornet bore the brunt of the attack. Waves of Japanese planes descended upon her, scoring multiple hits. Bombs smashed into the flight deck and torpedoes blew open her hull below the waterline. Flames roared across the ship. The crew fought with extraordinary courage, but the damage was beyond control. The Hornet, the same vessel that had launched the Doolittle raiders, was eventually abandoned. Even then, she refused to sink easily. American ships attempted to scuttle her but failed. Only when Japanese destroyers fired additional torpedoes did the Hornet finally slip beneath the waves. These losses were painful, but they also revealed the depth of American resolve. Even while losing precious ships, the United States was building more. Shipyards on the West Coast and along the Atlantic churned day and night, creating a continuous stream of new carriers, aircraft, and equipment. By the beginning of 1943, the first of the Essex-class carriers, larger, faster, and more capable than any that had come before, began joining the fleet. Each of these new ships carried more planes, had improved armor, and featured advanced radar systems that made them deadly against both surface and air threats. They represented the growing industrial power of the United States, a power Japan could not match. As American forces gradually secured Guadalcanal and turned their attention toward the Central Pacific, daily life aboard the carriers remained both monotonous and dangerous. Crews dealt with endless routines: aircraft maintenance, gunnery drills, fuel system inspections, and constant watch rotations. Nights at sea were often tense. The threat of submarine attack was continuous, and lookouts scanned the dark waves for the faintest sign of danger. The roar of aircraft engines echoed across the decks at dawn as pilots prepared for missions, and by evening the flight crews were exhausted from the day's operations. Yet, despite the fatigue, a sense of purpose united everyone aboard. The carriers were instruments of a larger strategy now taking shape: an ambitious, island-hopping campaign that would push steadily toward Japan itself. In 1943, the focus shifted to the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. These remote outposts, fortified by Japanese forces, represented stepping stones across the Pacific. Carrier aircraft played a crucial role in weakening these defenses. Raids were launched against supply depots, airfields, and garrisons, softening the islands before ground troops went ashore. Pilots grew more confident, now flying upgraded aircraft such as the F-6F Hellcat, which began to turn the tide of air combat firmly in America's favor. Unlike earlier in the war, when Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies, American aviators now went into battle with planes that matched or surpassed their opponents. During these operations, the coordination between carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, and ground forces became increasingly sophisticated. The U.S. Navy learned to integrate radar more effectively, track enemy aircraft at longer ranges, and direct fighter groups with precision. Support ships formed protective screens around the carriers, improving their chances of surviving enemy attacks. Every element of the task forces, air and sea, worked together in a way that would have been impossible at the beginning of the war. This growing coordination was one of the keys to the successes that followed. By the end of 1943, the carriers were no longer merely holding the line. They were spearheading the advance. Their aircraft struck at islands like Tarawa, Makin, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok, destroying Japanese bases and supporting amphibious assaults. Though these battles were often bloody, each victory brought the Allied forces one step closer to Japan's inner defensive ring. The men serving aboard the carriers began to sense that the tide had unmistakably turned. Yet they also knew that the most intense and decisive battles still lay ahead. Ahead of them waited the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, and the largest carrier battle in history. The carriers would soon face the full force of Japanese naval aviation in one final, desperate contest. It would be a battle that pushed the concept of carrier warfare to its absolute limit, and would mark the moment when American air power broke the last hope of the Japanese fleet. By early 1944, the United States Navy had become a fundamentally different force from the one that had struggled to survive in the dark months following Pearl Harbor. The fleet was larger, more experienced, and increasingly confident. The new Essex-class carriers formed the backbone of fast carrier task forces that could strike anywhere, in the Pacific with overwhelming intensity. With each passing month, their aircraft reached farther, hit harder, and returned with fewer losses. The pilots who once viewed Japanese Zero fighters with fear now approached combat with a cool confidence, flying aircraft that were faster, sturdier, and better armed. The balance of power had shifted decisively. The next great objective in the American march across the Pacific was the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Their capture would allow the United States to place long-range bombers within striking distance of Japan itself. But to seize these islands, the Navy had to break through one of the strongest defensive networks the Japanese Empire had ever constructed. And the Japanese Navy, aware of the stakes, prepared for what it hoped would be the decisive battle of the war. It believed that if it could destroy the new American carrier force in a single massive blow, the United States might hesitate long enough to negotiate or retreat. The stage was set for a confrontation on a scale the world had never seen. In June 1944, the two carrier fleets closed in on one another in what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a titanic clash that would later be known by a more dramatic name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was coined by American pilots who found themselves facing waves of poorly trained Japanese aviators flying increasingly obsolete aircraft. The early war elite pilots Japan had relied on so heavily were gone lost in battles from Coral Sea to Midway, from Guadalcanal to the Solomons. In their place were young men with limited training, desperate to defend their homeland but lacking the experience needed to challenge hardened American veterans. The battle began with massive Japanese air attacks directed at the American fleet. Dozens of aircraft roared in at high altitude, but American radar detected them early. Fighter directors guided intercepting Hellcats with precision, and soon the sky above the U.S. fleet turned into a chaotic swirl of diving and turning aircraft. The Hellcats cut through the Japanese formations with deadly efficiency. One by one, enemy planes fell in flames, leaving dark smoke trails across the blue Pacific sky. American pilots later described the experience not as a battle, but as a slaughter and overwhelming demonstration of technological and tactical superiority. Meanwhile, the American carriers launched their own counterstrikes. Their planes located the Japanese fleet and attacked carriers, battleships, and cruisers, scoring multiple hits. The Japanese carrier Taihu, new, powerful, and considered unsinkable, was fatally damaged when gasoline fumes ignited deep within her hull, causing catastrophic explosions. Other Japanese carriers met similar fates. The once dominant Imperial Navy was being shattered piece by piece. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost hundreds of aircraft and most of its remaining trained aviators. The backbone of Japanese naval aviation had been broken, and it would never fully recover. After the triumph in the Philippine Sea, the American carriers continued to support operations throughout the Marianas. Their planes struck inland targets, pounded defensive positions, and protected landing forces as they fought brutal battles among coral ridges and volcanic terrain. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam came at enormous cost, but the result was transformative. Now, American long-range bombers could begin the devastating air campaign against the Japanese homeland, striking industrial centers, military bases, and cities with increasing frequency. But the carrier fleet could not pause. Ahead lay the Philippines, a vast archipelago that Japan was determined to defend at any cost. The decision to invade the Philippines brought the U.S. Navy into another enormous battle, one that would dwarf even the Philippine Sea in scale. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in October 1944. It was not one battle, but 4 major engagements spread across hundreds of miles, involving hundreds of ships and more aircraft than any previous operation in naval history. And at the center of it all were the American carriers, providing the air power necessary to break the Japanese fleet once and for all. During the fighting off some air, small escort carriers far less powerful than the great Essex-class ships found themselves confronting overwhelming Japanese surface forces. But the aircraft they launched, along with the courageous actions of destroyers and destroyer escorts, turned what could have been a disaster into a stunning defensive victory. Pilots took off repeatedly with whatever bombs or torpedoes they could carry, sometimes launching without proper armament simply to distract or confuse the enemy. Men flew until they ran out of ammunition, then made mock attack runs to draw fire. American sailors who witnessed the battle spoke of bravery that defied explanation. At Leyte Gulf as a whole, the Japanese Navy made its last attempt to challenge American sea power. It failed. By the end of the battle, Japan's ability to wage large-scale naval warfare was permanently destroyed. From this point onward, the carrier force moved with a momentum that could not be stopped. Ahead lay Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the long, bitter approach to the Japanese mainland itself. Throughout these campaigns, carrier crews faced not only enemy action but relentless fatigue. Long periods at sea meant limited sleep, constant drills, and endless maintenance tasks. The dangers of the ocean itself, storms, rogue waves, mechanical failures, were never far away. On some nights, pilots returned from missions in darkness, landing on a pitching deck lit only by faint guide lights, their aircraft low on fuel. In storm conditions, even the largest carriers rolled heavily, flight decks rising and falling like the surface of a living creature. One misjudged landing, one moment of exhaustion, could mean death. And yet the rhythm of life aboard continued, the clang of metal in maintenance bays the rumble of aircraft. Warming on deck, the shouted commands of flight directors, the clatter of trays in the mess hall, the quiet conversations of men trying to find a moment of rest before the next launch. Over time, these ships became something more than machines. They became homes, symbols of power, and in many ways the beating heart of the Navy's Pacific strategy. As the war moved toward its final stages, the American carrier force would face its greatest human challenge yet, the rise of the kamikaze threat. It was a desperate tactic born of Japan's dwindling resources and collapsing strategic situation. And it would test the resolve of carrier crews in ways they never expected. By late 1944, as the United States Navy pushed ever closer to the Japanese mainland, the nature of the conflict began to change. The Japanese High Command, running out of aircraft, fuel, and experienced pilots, resorted to a new and desperate tactic, one that would shock American sailors and leave a lasting psychological scar on the men who faced it. This was the rise of the kamikaze, deliberate suicide attacks carried out by pilots who believed that crashing their aircraft into American ships was the only remaining way to defend their homeland. For the American carrier crews, the threat was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was unpredictable, relentless, and terrifying. The first major wave of kamikaze attacks came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and intensified dramatically in the battles that followed. Carriers, once protected by layers of escorting destroyers, cruisers, and combat air patrols, now faced pilots who ignored all conventional rules of engagement. Some came in low over the waves. Others dove from high altitude with engines screaming. They did not break off when hit. They did not attempt to escape. They continued their deadly descent until fire and smoke consumed them, or until they struck steel. Life aboard an American aircraft carrier became a constant state of vigilance. Radar operators scanned the skies, fighter directors coordinated defensive intercepts, and gunners manned their stations even during moments that once would have been considered peaceful. A single kamikaze could appear without warning, racing toward the ship at tremendous speed. Alarm bells rang, anti-aircraft guns roared to life, and tracer fire cut across the sky like glowing red threads. The crew moved in a synchronized blur, pilots racing to their fighters, flight deck crews clearing equipment, damage control teams preparing for impact. Every man on board knew that even the smallest lapse could result in catastrophe. The fast carriers were large and robust, but they were not invulnerable. When a kamikaze hit, the damage could be devastating. Aircraft parked on deck ignited, fuel lines ruptured, ammunition detonated, and fires spread with frightening speed. Still, the discipline of American crews often prevented far greater losses. Damage control teams trained to near perfection worked through smoke, flame, and blinding heat. They sealed compartments, extinguished fires, and saved ships that might otherwise have been lost. Their actions, quiet, unglamorous, and often overlooked, were essential to keeping the carrier fleet operational during these critical months. One of the defining battles of this period was the assault on Iwo Jima in early 1945. The small volcanic island was of enormous strategic value because it lay halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Capturing it would allow damaged B-29 bombers a safe landing place and give American fighters a base to escort long-range bombing missions. For 36 days, Marines fought a brutal, grinding campaign across a landscape of ash, caves, and fortified tunnels. Above them, American carriers maintained a constant presence, launching wave after wave of strikes to suppress Japanese defenses. Pilots flew multiple missions a day, sometimes returning with bullet-riddled wings, shredded control surfaces, and engines barely holding together. The heat of battle, the swirling volcanic dust, and the thick smoke that covered the island created some of the most hazardous flying conditions of the war. Yet, even as the carriers supported the Marines below, the Kamikaze threat continued. Some attacks narrowly missed their targets, others struck with devastating effect. Each hit was a reminder that victory in the Pacific came at a tremendous cost. When Iwo Jima finally fell, the fleet turned its attention to Okinawa, the last and largest stepping stone before an invasion of Japan itself. The operation, which began in April 1945, became the single bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, and for the American carriers, it became a crucible unlike anything they had ever faced. The Japanese launched the largest kamikaze offensive of the entire conflict, sending thousands of aircraft against the Allied fleet. Picked out from the sky, American carriers became prime targets. For weeks, the ocean around Okinawa turned into a battlefield of fire and steel. Sky after sky filled with black smoke, orange flame, and the thunder of exploding aircraft. Radar screens lit up constantly as new attacks formed. Fighters scrambled so often that pilots sometimes slept in their flight gear, helmets by their sides. Gunners fired until their arms trembled. Below deck, engineers and surgeons worked tirelessly patching holes, treating burns, saving lives. The pace of operations was relentless, the danger never ending. Yet, despite the intensity of the attacks, the American carrier fleet endured. The ships were damaged, sometimes severely, but they survived. Time and again, the crews demonstrated extraordinary resilience. This endurance was a testament not only to the strength of the carriers themselves, but to the training, organization, and courage of the men who served aboard them. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, Japan's kamikaze forces were effectively spent. The carrier fleet, battered but unbroken, moved ever closer toward the Japanese mainland. Air raids on Japan intensified, naval bombardments increased, and the once mighty Imperial Navy had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The war was entering its final phase, but the challenges that lay ahead would test the emotions, ethics, and endurance of every man involved. The carriers that had fought from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa were no longer simply machines of war, they had become symbols of American resolve. Floating steel cities that carried the hopes of a nation. Ahead lay the final chapter of the conflict. The bombings of the Japanese mainland, the moral reckoning of nuclear weapons, and the surrender that would bring an end to the most destructive war in human history. As the spring of 1945 gave way to summer, the war in the Pacific entered its most intense and consequential phase. American carrier task forces, now operating within striking distance of the Japanese mainland, unleashed a sustained and devastating series of air raids that pressed Japan to the brink of collapse. What had begun more than 3 years earlier as a desperate effort to survive the shock of Pearl Harbor had evolved into a systematic dismantling of Japan's military, industrial, and logistical capacity. The carriers, massive, relentless, and seemingly unstoppable, were now the sharpest spear point of Allied strategy. Day after day, American pilots took off from the decks of Essex-class carriers, flying north across the open waters toward targets deep inside Japan. They struck airfields, factories, naval ports, fuel depots, transportation hubs, and coastal defenses. They bombed aircraft on the ground before they could be used in kamikaze attacks. They destroyed rail lines, warehouses, and shipyards. With each passing week, Japan's ability to wage war evaporated further. Smoke rose from dozens of cities. The precision raids that began early in the year slowly transformed into widespread destruction that reflected the harsh reality. The Japanese military would not surrender easily, and the Allies believed that only overwhelming pressure could force an end to the conflict. For the American sailors aboard the carriers, the proximity to Japan brought a mixture of anticipation and dread. Many of these men had spent years pushing across the Pacific, fighting in campaigns that felt endless. Now, with the Japanese homeland finally within reach, they understood that the final act of the war could be the most dangerous of all. Carrier task forces operated near enemy shores, exposed to remaining aircraft, submarines, and coastal defenses. Even with Japan's resources nearly exhausted, the threat of a sudden attack hung over the fleet. Every strange radar return, every unidentified aircraft, every distant glimmer on the horizon triggered alarms. The tension was constant, and the stakes higher than ever. Yet, amid the strain of combat operations, moments of reflection emerged. Sailors looked out across the dark sea and thought about the long journey that had brought them here. Many remembered the confusion and fear of 1942, the desperate defensive battles, the uncertainty of whether America could turn the tide. Now they served aboard ships that symbolized overwhelming industrial power and strategic dominance. But the cost had been enormous. Thousands of lives had been lost in the carrier battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Thousands more had been claimed by Kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. The ocean, calm and blue on the surface, held the memories of countless men who had given everything. In July 1945, the carrier fleet supported the final bombardments of Japan. Carrier-based strikes destroyed remaining warships in their harbors, including the once proud battleships that had symbolized Japan's naval power. American aircraft roamed almost unchallenged across Japanese airspace. The air defense network that had once been formidable was now fragmented and ineffective. Fighter pilots, who earlier in the war had engaged in deadly dogfights against experienced opponents, found themselves flying missions where the primary danger came not from enemy fighters but from mechanical failures, flak bursts, or unpredictable weather. On the decks below, life settled into an intense routine. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft operational. Ordnancemen loaded bombs and torpedoes in near-silent efficiency. Engineers monitored the engines and electrical systems that powered the massive ships. Doctors treated injuries while chaplains offered comfort to those struggling with exhaustion or grief. Every part of the carrier worked in harmony. A floating world where thousands of men performed their duties with quiet professionalism. They knew the end was approaching, but they also knew that every mission still carried risk. Then, in early August 1945, the world changed. News reached the fleet that a single bomb had destroyed the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The power of the atomic weapons stunned sailors who had grown accustomed to conventional warfare. Many could not comprehend what they heard. A single aircraft had delivered destruction previously achievable only through massive fleets of heavy bombers. Rumors spread across the decks and questions filled the air. Would Japan surrender? Would there still be an invasion of the mainland? What would the post-war world look like? On August 15, 1945, the answer came. Japan announced its intention to surrender. The war, one of the most destructive conflicts in human history, was finally ending. Aboard the carriers, men who had endured years of battle found themselves overwhelmed with emotion. Some cheered, some cried. Some stood silently, staring out at the horizon. The tension that had dominated their lives for so long dissolved in a wave of relief. No more kamikazes. No more night landings after hours in the air. No more empty chairs in the mess hall. The carriers that had fought across the Pacific now shifted to occupation duties, air patrols, and humanitarian missions. Their decks, once crowded with armed aircraft, now carried supplies, medical equipment, and personnel for rebuilding efforts. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions instead of attack sorties. The guns that had guarded the fleet fell silent. For the men who served aboard these ships, the victory brought pride but also reflection. They had witnessed the rise of a new kind of warfare, one in which the aircraft carrier had become the central instrument of naval power. In the ashes of the war, they understood that the world had changed, and that the lessons of the Pacific would shape military strategy for generations to come. And so the carrier sailed home, welcomed by cheering crowds, brass bands, and families holding signs along the waterfront. The ships that had once been symbols of destruction were now symbols of victory and peace. But for the men who served aboard them, the memories remained. The sound of roaring engines, the smell of fuel and salt water, the shock of battle, the camaraderie forged in impossible circumstances. Their story, written in steel, fire, and courage, would stand as one of the defining chapters of World War II. When the guns finally fell silent and Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, a new era began for the American carriers that had carried the war across the Pacific. The ships that only months before had launched wave after wave of deadly airstrikes were now entering a transitional period, one marked by celebration, uncertainty, and reflection. For many sailors, the end of the war did not immediately mean a return home. Instead, the carriers shifted into a new phase of operations: occupation support, demobilization duties, and the transportation of troops back to the United States. In the first weeks after the surrender, American carriers anchored in Japanese waters witnessed scenes that would have been unimaginable earlier in the war. Airfields that once launched kamikaze attacks now served as landing strips for American reconnaissance flights. Japanese ships, their guns silent and their flags lowered, sat motionless in calm harbors. Civilians lined the roads, watching silently as American sailors came ashore to support the occupation. For the men of the carrier fleet, these sights felt surreal evidence that the terrible conflict that had consumed their youth was truly over. Yet even as peace settled over the Pacific, the carriers remained busy. They provided air patrols to maintain security during the early days of the occupation. They delivered supplies to devastated regions, assisted with the evacuation of prisoners of war, and carried diplomats, inspectors, and military officials across vast distances. Their flight decks, once crowded with armed fighters and bombers, now hosted aircraft carrying mail, photographic equipment, and humanitarian cargo. The shift from instruments of destruction to tools of restoration was gradual but profound. For many sailors, the biggest emotional challenge came not from ongoing duties, but from the sudden absence of danger. After years of living under constant threat, air raids, torpedoes, kamikazes, storms, mechanical failures, the quiet felt almost unnatural. Some men struggled to sleep in the peaceful environment. Others found themselves replaying vivid memories of battle. The roar of anti-aircraft guns, the flash of explosions, the shudder of the ship under near misses, the sight of damaged planes limping back to the deck. Victory had been achieved, but its costs lingered in the minds of those who had survived. The return journey home was one of the most unforgettable moments in the life of any World War II sailor. When the carriers approached American shores, they were met by crowds lining the coastline, waving flags, cheering, crying, and holding banners that stretched across rooftops and piers. Brass bands played patriotic marches. Families waited with signs bearing the names of their sons, husbands, and brothers. From the decks of the returning carriers, sailors leaned over the rails, scanning the faces, searching for loved ones they had not seen in years. The emotions ran deep. Joy, relief, disbelief, and in some cases, grief for the friends who would never return. Once home, the carriers themselves entered a new chapter. Some were placed into reserve fleets, where they would remain for years, silent and unmoving, their decks covered and their engines cold. Others continued to serve as training ships, ensuring that the next generation of naval aviators would learn from the legacy of the war. A few would soon find themselves called back to action in a new conflict, the Korean War proving that the aircraft carrier had not only transformed naval warfare, but had become indispensable to America's global role. For historians and naval strategists, the transformation brought by the carrier war in the Pacific was nothing short of revolutionary. Before World War II, battleships had been the unquestioned masters of the sea. Their massive guns and thick armor symbolized national power. Yet in battle after battle, carriers proved that the future of naval dominance belonged to the airplane. It was aircraft, not battleship shells, that destroyed the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor, in the Coral Sea, at Midway, in the Philippine Sea, and at Leyte Gulf. It was aircraft that brought the war to the Japanese homeland, neutralized airfields, sank warships in harbor, and shattered supply networks. The lessons learned aboard carriers during World War II reshaped military doctrine around the world. Radar control, long-range strike capability, coordinated air groups, damage control systems, and logistical support networks all evolved dramatically as the war progressed. Naval aviation emerged not as a supporting arm, but as the decisive force in maritime conflict. And the American carriers, the Essex class in particular, stood at the center of this transformation. Their speed, range, capacity, and survivability set a standard that influenced naval design for decades. Yet beyond the technical legacy lies the human one. The men who served aboard carriers during World War II came from every corner of America. Cities, farms, factories, schools. Many had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy. But through discipline, courage, and shared hardship, they became part of one of the most effective fighting forces in history. Their individual stories, some tragic, some triumphant, wove together into a larger narrative of endurance and sacrifice. In the years that followed, reunions were held, letters exchanged, and memoirs written. Former pilots remembered the exhilaration of takeoffs and the terror of night landings. Mechanics recalled working through exhaustion to repair aircraft for the next mission. Gunners spoke of the chaos and adrenaline of kamikaze attacks. And many remembered the quiet moments between battles, conversations on the deck at sunset, sharing letters from home, or watching the stars reflect on the vast Pacific. These memories formed a collective legacy, one passed from generation to generation. The aircraft carrier had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of American resilience, technological innovation, and the willingness of ordinary people to face extraordinary danger for the sake of victory. In the decades that followed World War II, the legacy of the American aircraft carriers that had fought across the Pacific only grew stronger. These ships, forged in the fire of the most destructive conflict in history, became the foundation on which the modern United States Navy was built. Their lessons earned through sacrifice, innovation, and relentless determination shaped not only American strategy, but global military doctrine for generations. As the post-war world settled into a tense and uncertain peace, it became clear that the aircraft carrier would remain essential to maintaining stability. The Cold War emerged almost immediately, revealing a geopolitical landscape dominated by two superpowers with clashing ideologies and expanding military capabilities. In this new era, the mobility and striking power of the carrier made it a perfect instrument of deterrence. Its presence in distant waters signaled resolve without the need to station armies on foreign soil. It could project force, deliver humanitarian aid, or evacuate civilians all from a moving base that needed no permission from anyone. Many of the carriers that had survived World War II were modernized, refitted with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and radar-guided systems. They transitioned from launching propeller-driven aircraft to jet fighters, marking a new technological leap. Pilots who once flew Hellcats and Corsairs now took to the skies in Panthers, Cougars, and early Phantoms, experiencing speeds and capabilities unimaginable during the Pacific War. The flight decks grew busier, louder, and more advanced, yet the fundamental spirit aboard remained the same, a disciplined and determined community working toward a common mission. For veterans who returned to civilian life, the war never fully disappeared. Many carried lifelong friendships formed aboard those floating cities. Others pursued careers in aviation, engineering, or public service, inspired by their wartime experiences. Some found peace in telling their stories. Others kept their memories locked away, too painful or too personal to revisit. But all understood that they had been part of something extraordinary and immense, nation-defining effort that changed the course of history. Museums and memorials across the United States began preserving the legacy of these great ships. Several carriers became floating museums, living monuments to the men who served aboard them. Visitors walked the same decks where pilots once sprinted toward their aircraft, stood beside the arresting wires that had caught returning planes, and explored the cramped rooms where sailors slept, ate, and planned missions. These preserved carriers like the USS Intrepid, USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, and USS Midway allowed new generations to witness firsthand the scale, complexity, and courage of naval aviation during the war. As time passed, historians continued to uncover more details, personal accounts, and technical insights from the Pacific Campaign. Scholars analyzed battle strategies, engineering innovations, and the rapid evolution of air warfare. They discovered how close some battles truly were, how moments of luck, quick thinking, or individual bravery had turned the tide. And they highlighted the enormous logistical effort behind every mission. The supply ships, repair crews, intelligence analysts, and support personnel who often worked far from the front lines yet were essential to victory. But beyond the facts and figures, beyond the diagrams and declassified reports, the true heart of the story remained human. It was found in the trembling letters written home before dangerous missions, in the photographs taken on deck between launches, in the recorded radio calls of pilots trying to land on a storm-tossed carrier at night, in the quiet testimonies of men who spoke decades later, their voices heavy with emotion. Their stories spoke of fear, courage, loss, and brotherhood, timeless human experiences that transcend the era in which they occurred. The carriers themselves evolved into symbols of American identity. They represented not just military power, but the capacity to rise from tragedy, adapt under pressure, and persevere against overwhelming odds. They embodied an industrial might that mobilized millions and transformed the nation's economy. And they reflected the ingenuity of engineers, designers, and workers who turned blueprints into reality at a pace the world had never seen. As the last veterans of the Pacific War grow older and pass into history, their legacy becomes even more precious. The lessons learned aboard those carriers about leadership, teamwork, and sacrifice remain relevant today. They remind us that freedom is fragile, that peace demands vigilance, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary acts when faced with extraordinary challenges. In a world still marked by conflict and uncertainty, the story of the American aircraft carriers of World War II offers guidance and inspiration. It teaches us about resilience in the face of despair, innovation in moments of crisis, and unity in pursuit of a common goal. It shows what can be achieved when a nation believes in itself and when individuals commit to something greater than their own survival. And so, as we look back on the journey that carried these ships from the devastation of Pearl Harbor to the triumph of victory in Tokyo Bay, we see more than a military saga. We see a testament to the human spirit, to courage under fire, to sacrifice that shaped a better world. The Pacific War ended nearly 8 decades ago. The decks where young pilots once raced to their aircraft now stand silent. The hangar bays echo only with the footsteps of museum visitors. The engines that once roared across the ocean rest in permanent stillness. But the legacy of those carriers and the men who brought them to life endures. In books, in museums, in the memories of families, and in the vast expanse of the Pacific itself, their story remains alive. They were more than ships. They were symbols of hope, weapons of liberation, guardians of freedom. And the men who served on them changed the course of history forever.